Hello, everyone. I'm Ken Schmitt, CEO and founder of Turning Point Executive Search and author of The Practical Optimist. It's a book that I'm very proud to have written all last year. And a couple of things come to mind, but one in particular, as far as a great piece of advice that I got when I was starting my business 16 years ago, was the importance of really building a niche and not trying to be all things to all people. So I live by that day in and day out.
Wow. So building a niche, that's interesting. So who gave you that advice? Like, were you starting out, midpoint, or second job, something like that? And how have you benefited from that?
Yeah, at the point that I got the advice, I had been in the recruiting world for 9 years. It's now been 26, but it was 9 years at that point. And the CEO that I reported to, who's still my biggest mentor in the business to this day, Ron Jervis, he was one of the ones that I really leaned on heavily as I was getting my business off the ground. And he said, Ken, you really figure out what your niche is. It could be anything. It could be a functional niche. It could be a type of industry client that you work with. It could be a level of position, whatever it is, but don't try to be all things to all people, right? Because then you wind up being so vanilla and such a generalist that nobody really knows exactly what category to put you in or how to contact you about a particular situation. But if you have a niche for yourself that you really spend time building out, that's going to take you very, very far.
Oh, wow. That's great. So he's not a Fred, though, huh? I'm
No,
kind of
he is not a
disappointed,
Fred.
huh?
He is probably the only boss that I reference in my book that is not a Fred. Not that when we kind of, I have a couple of friends actually whose names are Fred, and so when we decided to use the name Fred in my book for the bad bosses that I've had, I had to apologize to them. But yes, Ron Jervis is the complete opposite of a Fred.
That's awesome. That is awesome. Well, there's tons of great insight in your book and in The Practical Optimist, but I want to start with something that's maybe obvious to people, maybe not, and that is, what's the difference between an optimist and a practical optimist, and why did you decide to name your book that?
Yeah, it's always been a good balance for me, and I use that term as a blend of the skills and DNA that I got from both of my parents. My mom was a brilliant woman, very methodical, very thought provoking, could see several steps ahead. Not that she wasn't a risk taker, but a little bit less of a risk taker. So the practical side that I get, the need to always look at, okay, so what's the possible downside of any decision I might be making? That came from her. The optimistic side is my dad. He's the visionary. His name is Ken also. He's the visionary, kind of the typical entrepreneur, right? Where you kind of jump out of a plane and build the parachute on the way down, right? That cliche. So he's all about that. Very marketing focused, very much about saying yes, and then figure out how to actually deliver later on. So that balance of those two things is really important. It has been really important for me in my life. And I use that term because if you, to your question, if you are too much of a pure optimist, right, you might be taking too many chances, too many risks, whether with your own business, your own career, your family, the team that you're supporting as well. And you're not thinking about the ramifications and the issues that might come up based on your decisions if you're always thinking, looking through a rose-colored, lens, if you will. And on the flip side, if you're too practical all the time, then you're not taking enough risk and you're being, you're operating your business in a more of a conservative way and less risk taking, less chances, then you're really kind of behind the curve and you're not really more forward thinking, if you will. So that balance has always served me well over the years.
Definitely. Yeah, I can see that. It's nice to have that yin and that yang, if you will, of the parental figures that helps with that. And you mentioned that in the book, which I really enjoyed. I also love that you've got some action steps in each chapter. I find that books that do that are way more helpful than way more practical, I guess, if you will, than books that don't. So why did you choose to include action steps to help people figure that out?
Yeah, it really came out of, at the end of each chapter, we try to have an anecdote or example of whatever we're talking about in that particular chapter. So transparency, resilience, building values, building up your network, all those things, the importance of having a diverse team, all those different chapters that we had. We thought, well, how are we going to actually have a CTA, a call to action? How can we provide other either small business owners or entrepreneurs or departmental divisional leaders with some practical steps to take, based off of what I learned, the good and the bad, the right and the wrong things that I did over the years that will help them. And we wanted to try to distill it down into a few key action items, at the end of each chapter that again came from my own personal trial and error over the last 16 years of being a business owner. And we've gotten some great feedback from those action steps because they're meant to be, kind of easily digestible. It's not, it's not theoretical. It's not coming from a PhD, a very, long, kind of treatise around, how to do all these things. It's, here are things you can implement in your business, in your leadership style today, and see how they go. And here are the things to be aware of as you're starting to implement them.
Yeah. I found them very helpful as well. I very appreciate that you put those in there. So let's get a little practical here. Let's talk about some of these as well as share some of the stories. Lots of stuff in there. You mentioned some of them. Let's start with transparency. I mean, there's a story in the book, $200 left in your bank account, and you're willing to share that and talk about that. What was going through your head other than, oh shit, that you had $200 left, that led you to say to your team, to those that you serve as a leader, hey, here's what's going on and here's how we're going to get out of this?
Yeah, so it was a combination of, oh shit, what am I doing? But also, oh shit, why did I decide to do this in the first place? Right? Why didn't I just stay in my corporate career at Enterprise Rent-A-Car and put up with all the BS that I dealt with there, and just go that course, right? So it was a lot of second guessing and a lot of that wondering whether I made the right decision. So transparency, and again, this goes back to my parents. I grew up in a family. My sister is 4.5 years younger than me. My dad was a Jack in the Box franchisee. So for those listeners that are not in the western part of the U.S., it's a fast food chain like a McDonald's or a Burger King, if you will. And my mom was in real estate. And I grew up as the oldest, as the first grandchild in my extended family as well. Being treated more of as an adult, meaning that I got to listen to all the things that were happening in their respective businesses, the good and the bad, the tough situations, but also the successes. And so I kind of just absorbed that. I obviously I was too young to know that it was transparency as a term, but that was kind of ingrained in me at an early age. And that's just kind of the way that I operate. And there's a fine line, as I talk about in the book, a fine line between wearing your emotions on your sleeve, right, and TMI, and being a transparent leader where you do want to share things that are relevant so that the people around you in your business that are following you, that are on the same journey as you are, so they understand the reasons behind your decisions. Whether it's a decision, we recently I just was able to pay out bonuses this year for the first time in a couple of years. And everybody has known throughout this year how choppy it's been. This is 2023 we're talking, right? And it's been a very choppy year. And good quarter, bad quarter, good quarter, bad quarter. But we've had a great fourth quarter, and so I've been able to pay bonuses. But everybody on my team has been part of that journey, knows what's going on for the last 12 months of this year, and so they were also very happy to hear about the bonuses. And on the flip side, if there's tough times that just persist, right, that transparency is so important because then you get your team's buy-in. They understand what's going on. The first time you're talking about things being challenging is not when you're saying, hey, we've got to go through a layoff or a restructuring. That's really jarring. And you're able to really bring them along with you. And you also get great ideas. There are so many times in my 16 years of running my business where the ideas that we implemented didn't come from me. It came from my team, because I was able to, and I was willing to practice that transparency and that vulnerability by saying, hey guys, I know I'm the CEO of the company. I don't have the answer for this question. What do you all think? And without that transparency, you're missing out on that great wisdom that the rest of your team, brings to the table.
Awesome. So give us some action steps there, like you would in the book, right? Give us some action that we can take, because if we're not used to being vulnerable, if we're not used to being transparent, well, that might be hard for us. So how do we get started on that journey, Ken?
Yeah, and it's not an overnight change, right? Because it's going to be very jarring to your team if all of a sudden, if you have typically operated with things kind of close to your vest, and all of a sudden you come into the office on a Monday morning and talk about all these things that are going on, trying to be transparent, but it's going to be very, very, kind of discombobulating for your team. So it's got to be a gradual thing. I find for what works for me, right, is vulnerability. I'm willing to be vulnerable first, and then I'm always amazed at how that encourages others to reciprocate and be the same way. And as you're showcasing and kind of spotlighting that vulnerability, it then creates that sense of trust and transparency as well. So talking about things that are difficult, maybe choose one or two things that you've had to decide on over the last couple of months that was difficult to go through. I have an executive coach, for example, and it's amazing how even though the most elite athletes and astronauts and CEOs and leaders out there, everybody has an executive coach, but there's still a bit of a stigma like, oh, you have a coach, you must be broken in some way, right? Or a therapist. My wife is a therapist. We've been married for 31 years, so I'm very comfortable talking about therapy, but same thing with therapy. And I look at it in terms of that transparency. Like, no, I want to tell you, hey, this is what I'm doing to try to become a better whole person, right? And so when there are tough decisions to make, that's a good time to show that transparency. When you're struggling with something, good time to show transparency. CEOs should not expect, or leaders of businesses should not expect to have all the answers all the time. And so I think that's where you can really start with asking your team, hey, I'm struggling with this question, this concern, this issue. What do you think? What are your ideas? What comes to mind or to the table for you? And that's where that transparency, I think, really starts, in spades.
Yeah. Well, and to your point, getting more ideas helps us see around corners in ways we wouldn't otherwise do so. So I really like that. I think that being vulnerable first, asking questions, admitting that we don't know everything, great way to lead. With that, Ken, you mentioned in the green room as we we're starting, you've got a second piece of advice that you want to share. So what's that second piece of great advice?
Yeah, this advice came from my dad quite a while ago. Obviously, when he was running a business before I started my company. Also, this is a long time ago, but it's really stuck with me. And that is all about. And you've heard this probably cliche before, but it's praise in public, mentor in private. In other words, when something is going well, right, and your team member does something great, could be a peer, it could be your boss, it could be a subordinate, whatever it is. When something's going well and there's a success, you want to really, highlight that in front of the rest of the team. It shows transparency. It shows that you're paying attention as the leader to the successes that person may have had. And that's a great way to build that person's confidence, but also to showcase to the rest of your team that, hey, this is important. Praise and talking about successes is important to Ken and must be important to us as the team members as well. So that's super important. And the flip side, when somebody makes a mistake, we all make mistakes, CEOs included. When we make a mistake, you don't want to call that out and spotlight that mistake in front of other people. That's where the mentoring, right? That's where that constructive feedback happens in private, one-on-one. And I've used that as kind of the driver, if you will, for how I operate, how I manage, how I lead my team, and it goes a very long way. And again, it brings everything back to that earlier conversation around transparency and vulnerability. If you talk about, hey, here's something you did great, but here's something that maybe you should improve a little bit, you've got to do that in a way that's not going to be off-putting or create a defensive stance, among the team members that you're trying to mentor. So it's really important to keep that in mind, that you're praising in public, but mentoring in private.
That's great advice. I think also that praise and the mentoring in private, we have to be as specific as we can with people around the situation, because I think a lot of times we talk in such broad terms that we forget that not everybody sees what we see. So we have to help kind of zoom that in and be specific about that. Have you found that as well as the CEO?
Definitely, yeah. And the way it manifests for me is when I worked for Enterprise Rent a Car many years ago in the early '90s, it was a great organization, and I got to learn a lot at a very young age. But I learned how to not do a performance review with my experience with them. And to your point, this is a great example of how people can take some action steps today. Change up how you do your review, right? Performance reviews, when you do it once a year, you don't remember as a CEO what happened 9, 10, 12 months ago, right? Unless you're jotting things down and you're keeping some kind of a record of it, which most folks really don't. So you're racking your brain in December, January every year trying to figure out what happened, in the last 12 months. But if you are doing more ongoing conversations, ongoing mentoring conversations, we call them career conversations in the recruiting world, then it's more real time. And when you're mentoring somebody to help them get better at their craft, right, to help them improve how they operate, doing it in real time every month, every 6 weeks is much more effective and much more powerful than waiting until December or January to then retroactively go back and look and try to remember what happened. So that real-time mentoring is super important, and I think it really does help the impact, improve the impact, increase the impact, in that real-time setting.
Definitely. Definitely. I think that that real time is so important. We can do that. We can also then make sure we record it so that we have it, to your point, because if we do that year-end recap, well, it's nice to kind of have that laundry list, but that's a much more open conversation. And often that's a greatest hits, right? We see the good things that folks do, because I can't correct what you did in January here in November, December. But if I see a trend here, well, now we've got something else. So I think that's great. Well, let's move into talking. Lots of great stuff in the book, by the way. Let's talk about staying connected and how that has played out for you, because that's one of the things I think leaders sometimes forget, is that we have to stay connected with our teams, with the outside as well, to make that work. So talk about, Ken, how you've done that, and really what that means to you.
Yeah, and the chapter in the book focuses on the fact that it's very lonely at the top, right? And quote unquote at the top could be the leader of your team, of a division, of a company, CEO, whatever, even a board, chairman. In those roles, it can be very lonely, especially as a small business owner, right? As we both know, because at the end of the day, even though you might have a very transparent operating style and a very, very close-knit team, at the end of the day, you as the leader are making those final decisions. When you have only $200 left in your bank account and you can't make payroll, you're the one that's got to figure it out at the end of the day. No one else is going to do that for you, right? So that's really important. But I think from a standpoint of staying connected, that's, at least for me, it's helped tremendously. So there's different ways to do it. It's a little easier for those of us that are a little bit more extroverted. I realize that. In fact, I was telling my wife a couple of days ago, I'm like, oh my gosh, this week I'm going to be in the office, in my home office, 4 days before I get to do anything outside that's networking related. And that drives me crazy, right? I really like to be out with people, going to a networking event or meeting for coffee, that kind of thing. But for those that are more introverted, that get more comfort and more confidence out of doing things on their own, it's not as natural to them to go out. However, it's equally as important. Whether you're an introvert or an extrovert, it's equally important to stay connected. And you can do that in different ways, right? So for example, I have several groups. I have my executive coach, as I talked about. That's one way. I'm very close to my team that I manage as well. That's another way. But I like to have an external, resource to go to that I can talk to on a regular basis. So I have what I call my recruiter club. And it's myself and 6 others. Each of us own our own recruiting firm. So we're all in the same industry. We all understand the challenges, opportunities within our dynamic in our industry, but we're non-competitive. And we talk over email or on the phone every month, but we meet in person, at least once a quarter. And it's a great way to level set and realize, okay, the challenges that I'm having may not be specific to me. It might be an industry-wide trend, right? Or there are things that my peers are doing, and things that they implemented that worked really well that I can also try, things that I didn't think about myself. So that's one way to stay connected and to have that peer group for sure as well. And then being part of a networking organization, again, it's just, for me, getting out there and level setting and getting a sense for what is everybody else going through right now. And if it is just me, if for whatever reason my particular business is having a unique challenge, I can usually get some ideas from other people if I'm staying connected. Right. I don't want the only time that I ever contact them is to say, hey, things are really shitty right now. Help me. That's not very effective. And it's not really a good friendship or relationship. It's got to be two-way. I've got to be willing to help them and offer suggestions when they ask for it, just as much as I expect them to reciprocate too. So those are some great ways to stay connected and to do things on a regular basis. Again, especially if your natural instinct and default mode is to be more introverted and kind of keep to yourself. It can be very isolating. And I think we all learned that during COVID, right? I mean, it was those of us that are extroverted were forced to stay indoors for weeks and weeks and weeks on end. And it just, for me anyway, it drove me crazy. It was I was excited to go to the grocery store because I got to at least see other people, right? So you got to figure out kind of that right balance for sure. But staying connected is really important as in any kind of a leadership role.
Yeah. Well, one of the things that I like about that is that you offer some insight there for both introverts and extroverts, which I think is important. A lot of times we default as leaders, we default to what's natural for us, and I like that that you spoke on that because that's important. And with that, I think one of the ways that we can stay connected is something you do, and that is, and obviously we're doing right now, and that is have a podcast. Even if you're more introverted, it's an opportunity to go one-on-one. So what was the thought process behind creating the Practical Optimist podcast, Ken?
That's a good question. So I think it again came from me being more extroverted and wanting to connect. You know, the short version is that. So I founded and ran an organization for almost 11 years called the Sales and Marketing Leadership Alliance. And we had a chapter. I'm based in San Diego. We had a chapter here, up in Orange County, and also Los Angeles. And we had a speaker at each. It was a speaker-driven event. Speaker and attendees every single month in each of those three cities for many years. Then COVID hit, right? And everything went virtual. And it was tough to get back to the same numbers and the same volume of attendees post-COVID. And so we thought, well, it's been 10 years. Okay, so it's probably run its course. And so one of the ways that I wanted to stay connected to your earlier question was to continue to interview and talk to other individuals that are in leadership roles. And obviously, a podcast is a great platform from that, as you know. And it was a little daunting at first to get it set up, trying to figure out, does this really make sense? And you always had these aspirations of, I'm going to start this podcast and it's going to be, millions and millions of followers, and I'm going to monetize it with great advertisers. I'm going to sell it to Amazon one day. And obviously you learn very quickly, no, that's not how it works. So for me, the podcast has been a chance for me to stay connected, kind of a platform and kind of a mechanism to stay connected. But also, more importantly, to help my team internally, but also my network of candidates and placements that we've made, and my clients also, to hear from other leaders and to hear the expertise that other leaders can share around what they do, how they do it, and what's worked for them, and also the mistakes that they've made. So that, again, you don't feel so alone in trying to make this daunting decision, and you realize, hey, you know what? I can probably get through this. It might be a mistake, but I can make it work. And hearing other people talk about their mistakes, we have this segment called Your Do Over and Your Do Again on the podcast. The do-over is obvious. What are the things that you wish you had done differently during the course of your career? But the do-agains are, what are the things that have become the fabric of who you are as a leader, that you constantly implement or fall back on to help you become a good leader, but also to help you in a given situation? And that's a really great way to start off the podcast, with that vulnerability around, hey, what are the mistakes that you made? We all made them. Let's talk through them. So that was the goal. So we launched the book in January, The Practical Optimist. We launched the podcast in February of 2023 with the same name. We then actually rebranded the podcast only very recently, and now it's called Leadership Happens, with the last letter in leadership is an asterisk, because it could be leadership, it could be leadership, right? Either way, it's going to happen. So we realized that all of our conversations in the first season were all about leadership. So let's use a new name that reflects those leadership conversations. And it's been great. I've had such a blast talking to so many great people.
Awesome. Love that. I'll have to check that out again. So cool. So with that, any mistakes that you want to share that maybe being a practical optimist helped you overcome, Ken?
Yeah, I think this is many come to mind, but I think one that probably we can all, it resonates with everybody here, and it makes some sense to a lot of people, whether you're in a leadership role or not, is really taking ownership of the people around you and hiring them, but also realizing that not everybody is going to work out. Not everybody is the right fit for your team, for your organization, and for whatever your business happens to be. And for me, it's manifested in the way of trying to hire salespeople. The first person I tried to hire in sales was a very junior person, very bright, very intelligent individual, but had always done a certain kind of sales, very different from the kind of sales that we did. And brought the person on board. And my mistake, the first mistake in this example, was that I gave this person all of the leads that were coming into the company, right? Thinking that would help build confidence, get some experience and understanding around the actual organization, how we operate. So I kept giving leads to that person, thinking eventually they will start to generate their own leads, right? Very specific to sales, but still very relevant. And unfortunately, that person just never caught on, never brought in their own searches, never did any other of their own lead generation. So the first mistake was giving the leads. The second mistake, and the bigger one, was me not acknowledging sooner that it just wasn't the right fit. I spent so much time just, beating myself up saying, what am I doing wrong? I'm not a good leader because I can't get this person to perform. I hired an outside coach for this person for 90 days to help with that, paid extra money for that, obviously, and just kept trying to figure out where did I miss the boat? What can I do differently? It took me a year and a half to finally sit down with this person and say, you know what, this is not working out. It's time for us to part ways. It was about a year too late, honestly. It was so that was my bigger mistake, was not owning up to the fact that I made a mistake with this hire. It's not going to work out. I can only do so much, but we need to move on.
Wow. Thank you for being vulnerable and sharing that. That's a
Sure.
mistake we can all learn from. So
Yes.
good stuff there. So before I ask you the last question, though, I just want to remind folks, hey, friends, get a copy of The Practical Optimist. It's super simple to read. It's fun. If you've enjoyed listening to Ken, the book, you can hear his voice and hear his passion, hear his savviness through here. So I encourage you to check that out. You can learn more about that at his website at turningpointrecruiting.com. He's on LinkedIn, so you can connect with him there, Ken Schmitt. But Ken, if we want to get started, absolutely. If we want to get started being more of a practical optimist, especially as a leader, what would be the first step or two that people need to take?
Yeah, so back to your comment, your question earlier about action items. So one of the things I talk about is that it's important to take inventory, right? To look at the decisions that you've made in your life, professionally and possibly personally, over to, let's say, the last 6, 12, whatever months, whatever time frame makes the most sense for you, and look at that as objectively as possible, and use that as a tool, as a guide to figure out, am I being too practical or am I being too optimistic? For example, if you're being too optimistic when you do that professional inventory of decisions that you've made, if you're constantly seeing the fact that you are kind of chasing the shiny object, as they say, I'm going to start this, I'm going to start that, I'm going to go this direction, I'm going to go that direction, and either nothing gets finished, or each thing that you started, none of them have really had any kind of positively material impact on your business, you're probably being too optimistic. You're thinking that all these great ideas that you have swirling around in your head, they're all great. Let's implement all of them. And you're not looking at it through enough of a practical lens to say, all right, is this really the best use of my time? Should I really be prioritizing this? And, or should I be going somewhere else? So I think that's one, good example of that also. And likewise, if you're doing that same inventory and you're realizing, as you're making a list of all the things, all your decisions, all the scenarios that you were faced with, what your decision was, and then what the result or impact was, as you're going through that analysis, if you're realizing that, everything that I have tried has worked out, that's great. Kudos to you, hand clapping for sure. But that also might mean that you're not taking enough risk and you're being too practical, right? Because if you're constantly doing exactly what you set out to do, maybe what you set out to do was really not that much of a departure or that much of a stretch. Are you really challenging yourself to get out of your comfort zone? Are you really pushing yourself out there to try something different and just see what happens, right? I mean, if you're not failing at least some of the time, then you're probably not pushing yourself all the time. That's my thought.
Awesome. Love that. Practical and optimistic, as I would expect from you. So congrats again, Ken, on the book. It's fantastic. The Practical Optimist is great stuff. Friends, if you're listening, check out turningpointrecruiting.com. Ken's podcast is there. You can learn more from him. He's got some other resources there for you. Take a look. And remember, it's about balancing the practicality and the optimism. Take that inventory, take Ken's advice, and be a more practical optimist. Thanks so much, Ken.
Thanks so much for having me.